April 19th, 1945, 11:40 hours. Village ruins near Yonabaru, southern Okinawa. Corporal Michael Torres of the 96th Infantry Division moved through the smoking remains of what had been a farming village 2 days earlier, his rifle raised and finger near the trigger. The battle for this section of Okinawa had been brutal. Japanese forces had defended every house, every wall, every pile of rubble with fanatic determination. His unit had cleared the area building by building, expecting armed resistance from every shadow. What they found instead made Torres lower his weapon immediately. From a collapsed root cellar, a woman emerged carrying an infant. Behind her came more civilians, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all emaciated, filthy, their clothes torn and blood-stained. Old men who could barely walk. Children who looked like skeletons wrapped in skin. Mothers clutching babies too weak to cry. They shuffled into the open, blinking in the sunlight, and when they saw American uniforms, they froze in collective terror. The woman with the infant began speaking rapidly in Japanese, words tumbling out in panic. Torres didn't need translation to understand she was begging him not to kill them, not to hurt the children, to make it quick if he had to kill them at all. Her face showed no hope of mercy, only desperate pleading that death come swiftly. Torres looked at the terrified civilians, at the hollow-cheeked children, at the baby in the woman's arms who was so malnourished its head seemed too large for its body. He'd been in combat for 6 months. He'd killed men. He'd watched friends die. He'd developed the psychological armor necessary to function in mechanized warfare. But looking at these starving civilians who thought he was going to execute them, something broke inside that armor. He lowered his rifle completely, pulled off his pack, and dug out every ration he carried. C-ration cans, chocolate bars, crackers, everything. He set them on the ground, backed away, and made eating gestures, pantomiming putting food in his mouth, pointing at the children, then at the food. The civilians stared at the rations like they were hallucinating. The woman with the infant took a tentative step forward, then another. When Torres smiled and nodded encouragement, she suddenly rushed forward, grabbed a can of rations, and collapsed to her knees crying. Behind her, the other civilians surged toward the food, and within seconds they were eating with desperate hunger, not even bothering to fully open cans, just scraping out whatever they could reach. Torres called over his squad. "Empty your packs. Give them everything we've got. Corp, we need those rations for—" "Give them the goddamn food!" Torres's voice cracked. "Look at them. They're starving to death." Within minutes, every American soldier in the squad had given away their rations. They watched Japanese civilians, people who'd been their enemies minutes earlier, eating American military food and crying with relief. One little boy, maybe 5 years old, took a bite of chocolate and stared at Torres with an expression of pure wonder, like he'd forgotten sweetness existed. "They thought we were going to kill them," Torres said quietly to his squad leader. "They thought we were monsters, and we gave them lunch." For tens of thousands of Japanese civilians caught in Okinawa's brutal 3-month battle, encounters with American forces initiated a psychological transformation more profound than any propaganda could achieve. They'd been taught Americans were demons who tortured and murdered prisoners. Instead, they found soldiers who shared food with starving enemies, who carried wounded civilians to aid stations, who treated Japanese children with the same care they'd give their own. The mathematics of desperation. By April 1945, Okinawa's civilian population faced systematic starvation as the island became battlefield, consuming everything. The Japanese military had commandeered all food supplies, driven civilians from their homes to make room for defensive positions, and left families to survive however they could, while armies fought around them. The numbers tell the story of a catastrophe unfolding in real time. When the Battle of Okinawa began, around 300,000 civilians lived on the island. By the time it ended 3 months later, between 100,000 and 150,000 of them were dead. Many caught in the crossfire, others lost to hunger and disease. Tens of thousands more were missing. American forces found nearly 200,000 civilians alive, but most were barely surviving. 120,000 showed signs of severe malnutrition. Some 15,000 to 20,000 children had been orphaned. Their daily food intake had fallen to just 200 to 600 calories, barely a third of what a human body needs to live. The starvation wasn't incidental to combat. It was a systematic result of Japanese military policy that prioritized soldiers over civilians, commandeered all food for military use, and left civilian populations to starve while armies fought for control of the island. Japanese authorities had also distributed propaganda claiming Americans would torture and kill any civilians they captured, leading thousands to hide in caves and refuse food that American forces tried to provide. The combination of actual starvation and propaganda-induced terror created humanitarian crisis that shocked American forces unprepared for the scale of civilian suffering. Combat units expecting to fight Japanese soldiers instead found themselves providing emergency humanitarian aid to populations dying of hunger and disease. The immediate response. American forces responding to discoveries of starving Japanese civilians improvised humanitarian operations without orders, doctrine, or preparation. Combat soldiers who'd been fighting desperate battles hours earlier suddenly became relief workers distributing food, water, and medical care to enemy civilians. The response happened organically at squad and platoon level. Individual soldiers would encounter starving civilians and share their rations. Officers would see the need and authorize distribution of unit supplies. Medical personnel would set up aid stations treating civilian casualties alongside military wounded. The humanitarian work expanded from individual acts of mercy to systematic operations without formal policy directing the transformation. Private First Class James Chen, a medic with the 1st Marine Division, described the shift. "One day, I'm treating Marines wounded in combat. The next day, I'm treating Japanese kids dying of starvation and dysentery. Nobody told us to do it. We just couldn't not do it. You'd see a child who looked like a skeleton, crying from hunger, and you'd give them your rations. It was automatic. The fact that they were enemy civilians became irrelevant the moment you saw how much they were suffering. The impromptu relief operations consumed significant resources. Units distributed rations faster than supply chains could replace them. Medical supplies intended for American casualties went to treating Japanese civilians. Personnel hours that should have been dedicated to combat operations went instead to humanitarian work. By any military efficiency standard, the aid operations were wasteful and detrimental to combat readiness. But American commanders increasingly authorized and formalized the relief efforts rather than stopping them. The humanitarian operations achieved tactical benefits. Civilians who received food and medical care provided intelligence, evacuated combat zones, and stopped resisting American control. More fundamentally, American officers couldn't bring themselves to order their troops to stop feeding starving children, even when those children belonged to enemy nation. The cave evacuations. Throughout Okinawa, thousands of Japanese civilians had taken refuge in the island's extensive cave systems, hiding underground for weeks or months while battles raged above. The caves offered protection from artillery and bombing, but became death traps where starvation, disease, and despair killed as efficiently as combat. American forces clearing cave systems discovered families who'd been underground so long they'd lost track of time, surviving on rainwater and whatever edible material they could find. Children who'd forgotten what daylight looked like. Elderly who'd died sitting upright because there was no space to lie down. The cave populations represented concentrated human suffering that exceeded anything most American soldiers had witnessed. The evacuation of cave civilians required overcoming both practical and psychological obstacles. Practically, the civilians were often too weak to walk out unaided. Psychologically, they'd been conditioned to fear American capture more than death, leading many to attempt suicide rather than surrender or to fight against rescue efforts. Sergeant Robert Morrison described evacuating a cave complex near Shuri. "We could hear them inside, children crying, adults talking. We used interpreters to call for them to come out, promising food and safety. At first, nothing. Then one woman stepped out carrying a baby. She was so thin she could barely stand, but she was carrying that baby like it weighed nothing, because it probably did weigh almost nothing. When we gave her food and water instead of shooting her, she called back into the cave. Within an hour, maybe 200 people came out, all starving, all terrified, all crying when they realized we weren't going to hurt them. The cave evacuations became standard operations, requiring specialized procedures. Interpreter teams would approach caves and call for surrender, emphasizing food and medical care rather than threats. Combat engineers would sometimes blast additional openings to allow resistant civilians to escape without approaching Americans directly. Medical personnel would establish treatment stations near cave entrances to provide immediate care for evacuees too weak to walk further. The operations saved thousands of lives, but also created enduring images that challenged both American soldiers' expectations and Japanese civilians' propaganda-induced beliefs. Americans carrying Japanese children from caves, medics treating elderly Japanese civilians with the same care they'd give American casualties, combat soldiers sharing rations with starving enemy populations. The images contradicted everything both sides had been taught about the other. The children's transformation. The relationships created by food sharing were particularly powerful. Children who'd been starving learned that Americans were the source of food, safety, and treats like chocolate they'd never experienced before. The psychological association between American presence and survival became embedded in memories that would last lifetimes. 6-year-old Keiko Nakamura, living in a refugee camp near Naha, formed an attachment to Staff Sergeant Frank DeLuca, who'd give her candy whenever he saw her. She'd wait by the camp entrance for his jeep, run up when he arrived, and receive whatever treats he'd saved from his rations. The relationship was simple: an American soldier and a Japanese child who couldn't speak each other's languages, but who communicated through smiles and candy bars. But the simplicity contained profound meaning about mercy transcending enmity. The children's rapid adaptation to American presence influenced their parents' attitudes. Adults watching Americans treat their children with kindness found it increasingly difficult to maintain propaganda-induced hatred. If these Americans were monsters, why did they share food with Japanese children? If they were demons, why did they treat sick children with the same medical care they'd give their own? The surrender and collapse. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the immediate military crisis ended, but humanitarian catastrophe was only beginning. Japan's industrial capacity had been destroyed by bombing. Agricultural production had collapsed from labor shortages and systematic neglect. Distribution systems had been shattered by interdiction of rail and shipping networks. The fishing fleet was gone. Stored food reserves were exhausted. The numbers revealed a nation on the brink of collapse. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, its population stood at roughly 72 million, yet 50 to 60 million were already struggling with food insecurity. Without external aid, as many as 15 million people faced the very real threat of starvation. In major cities, the average person survived on just 700 to 1,000 calories a day, barely enough to stand, let alone work. The minimum required for survival was 1,200 to 1,500 calories, and Japan's agricultural production had fallen to only 40% of its pre-war level. With food reserves lasting barely 2 to 3 months at subsistence rations, the entire nation stood on the edge of famine. The American occupation forces landing in Japan in late August and September 1945 encountered population on the edge of mass starvation. Urban areas were particularly desperate. Millions of people concentrated in bombed-out cities, with no local food production and distribution systems that had ceased functioning. The crisis demanded immediate humanitarian response on scale that exceeded any previous relief operation. The entire Japanese population needed feeding until agricultural production could be restored and distribution systems rebuilt. The occupation couldn't stabilize Japan politically if the population was starving. Military government couldn't function if civilians were dying of hunger in the streets. The emergency relief operations. American occupation authorities established emergency food relief operations within days of landing in Japan. The operations began before formal policy was established, driven by military commanders who recognized that feeding the population was prerequisite for successful occupation. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, made the fundamental decision to use American military resources to prevent mass starvation in Japan. His orders were unambiguous: feed the Japanese population as first priority of occupation, using whatever military resources were necessary. The relief operations mobilized logistics capabilities that had won the Pacific War. Ships that had carried troops and ammunition now carried wheat, rice, and powdered milk. Trucks that had supplied combat operations now distributed food to civilian populations. Warehouses that had held military supplies became food distribution centers. The scale of the American response showed an extraordinary commitment. Between September and December 1945, the United States shipped nearly 800,000 tons of food to Japan. More than 15,000 military and civilian personnel worked day and night to coordinate relief. Over 5,000 distribution points were established across the country, feeding 15 to 20 million civilians directly. School lunch programs reached an additional 3 million children every day. In just the first 6 months, the U.S. government spent more than $250 million in 1945 dollars to ensure that a former enemy would not starve. The operations required solving unprecedented logistical challenges. Japan's transportation infrastructure was destroyed, making distribution difficult. Language barriers complicated coordination. Cultural differences required sensitivity in program design. Black market activities diverted resources. But American personnel solved each problem through systematic organization and sustained effort. The medical missions. Alongside food relief, American medical personnel conducted public health campaigns addressing disease and malnutrition throughout Japan. The medical operations treated immediate health crises while building infrastructure that would support longer-term population health. The medical crisis was just as devastating as the hunger. By the end of 1945, an estimated 3 to 4 million Japanese were suffering from tuberculosis. Among children, 2 to 3 million showed visible signs of severe malnutrition. Hospitals, many still in ruins, were overwhelmed with cases of dysentery and infectious diseases. Deficiencies in vital vitamins led to outbreaks of beriberi and pellagra, illnesses once thought to be under control. Infant mortality reached 120 deaths per 1,000 births, and the average life expectancy had fallen to just 50 years, down from 57 before the war. Japan's population had survived the bombs, but now it was fighting for its health. American medical personnel established clinics throughout Japan, providing free treatment to civilian populations. The facilities offered services most Japanese had never accessed, even during peacetime. Modern medications, surgical procedures, preventive care programs. The systematic provision of medical care demonstrated American commitment to Japanese welfare that exceeded minimum occupation requirements. Navy Corpsman Robert Martinez, working in a civilian clinic in Kyoto, treated dozens of Japanese patients daily. Many had never seen a doctor before. They'd suffered from treatable conditions for years because medical care was unavailable or unaffordable. When American medics provided free treatment using superior medicines, the patient's gratitude was overwhelming. The medical missions particularly focused on children, who bore the heaviest burden of wartime privation. Malnutrition had stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and created developmental delays. American pediatric programs provided supplementary nutrition, vitamin treatments, and medical care specifically designed for children recovering from prolonged deprivation. The School Lunch Revolution. One of Garriowa's most successful programs was the School Lunch Initiative that provided daily meals to millions of Japanese children. The program ensured that every child received adequate nutrition regardless of family economic circumstances. The American-backed school lunch program quickly became a symbol of recovery. By 1947, nearly 5 million Japanese children were receiving hot meals every school day. Each lunch provided 600 to 700 calories, including protein, grains, vegetables, and milk. Foods many children had never tasted before. The results were immediate and measurable. School attendance rose by 15 to 20%. Teachers noticed sharper focus and renewed energy. And medical reports showed clear improvements in height and weight among students. For a generation that had known nothing but war and hunger, those meals represented something more than nutrition. They were proof that the future could be better. The program also introduced Japanese children to American foods, bread, milk, butter, canned fruits, that would become part of Japanese diet in subsequent decades. The cultural exchange through food created a generation of Japanese who associated American presence with full stomachs and the security of knowing they'd eat lunch every day. Teachers reported dramatic changes in classroom dynamics after school lunches began. Children who'd been listless and unable to concentrate became engaged learners. Attendance improved because families knew their children would receive food at school even if there was no food at home. The academic environment improved because students weren't constantly distracted by hunger. The breaking of propaganda. The systematic provision of food aid and medical care by American forces achieved what political programs and propaganda campaigns never could. It broke Japanese indoctrination about American character through direct personal experience. Every Japanese civilian who received food from American hands experienced contradiction. Of that, roughly $1.7 billion went directly to food: rice, wheat, milk, and other essentials that kept millions alive. At its peak, American assistance supplied 20 to 25% of all the food consumed in Japan. More than 20,000 American soldiers and civilians were assigned to relief operations, coordinating shipments, distribution, and medical support. Economists later estimated that this aid saved between 2 and 4 million lives. The math was staggering, roughly $600 to $1,200 for every life saved. But to those who survived, that number was priceless. The numbers documented that American aid had literally saved millions of Japanese lives that would have been lost to starvation and disease without intervention. The cost per life saved was a remarkable bargain by any calculation, representing commitment to humanitarian values that transcended recent enmity. The final proof. By 1950, Japan had recovered from the brink of mass starvation to relative food security. Agricultural production had been restored. Distribution systems had been rebuilt. The population had regained health and could sustain itself without continued emergency aid. The crisis had been averted through American commitment and Japanese resilience. The recovery validated the American approach of providing comprehensive aid rather than minimal assistance. The investment in feeding Japan paid strategic dividends that extended far beyond humanitarian considerations. A prosperous, stable Japan became American ally rather than conquered enemy. Bulwark against communist expansion rather than vacuum that Soviet influence might fill. But beyond strategy and politics, the feeding of Japan represented something more fundamental. The choice to treat defeated enemies as human beings deserving of help rather than as conquered population deserving only exploitation. American soldiers who shared rations with starving Japanese children, medics who treated enemy civilians with the same care they'd give their own, administrators who worked long hours between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing. The propaganda had said Americans were barbarians who'd enslave or kill defeated populations. The reality was Americans feeding their children and treating their sick. The cognitive dissonance was inescapable. The breaking of propaganda happened in countless small moments. A mother watching an American soldier give candy to her child. An elderly man receiving rice rations from enemy he'd been taught to hate. A sick child treated by American medic who showed the same care he'd give his own family. Each encounter challenged propaganda and created space for new understanding of what America represented. The transformation operated at emotional level rather than intellectual level. Japanese civilians didn't analyze American motives or debate political philosophy. They simply experienced kindness from people they'd expected to be cruel, and the experience changed their understanding of the world more profoundly than any argument could. Michiko Tanaka, who'd received food aid as a teenager in Tokyo, described the psychological impact. "We'd been taught Americans were demons without human feelings. But the soldiers who gave us food were young men who showed pictures of their own families, who smiled at our children, who treated my sick grandmother with gentleness. I couldn't reconcile what I'd been taught with what I saw. Eventually, I had to accept that the propaganda had been lies, and these Americans were just people trying to help us survive." That realization changed everything. The cost and commitment. The American commitment to feeding Japan came at significant financial cost during a period when American taxpayers were eager to reduce military spending and bring troops home. The domestic political pressure to end costly overseas commitments was intense. But American leaders, military and civilian, maintained the feeding programs despite costs and criticism because they recognized that Japanese stability required fed population. The investment in Japanese food security was investment in creating stable, democratic Japan that wouldn't threaten future peace. The cost of compassion was enormous, but so was the impact. Between 1945 and 1951, the United States provided more than $2.5 billion in aid to Japan, ensuring food reached those who needed it. All demonstrated that mercy could survive total war, and that former enemies could become partners in building peace. The Japanese civilians who burst into tears when American soldiers saved them from starvation weren't crying just from relief at receiving food. They were crying because everything they'd been taught about their enemies had been revealed as lies, because they'd discovered that mercy could come from unexpected sources, and because they'd learned that even after the most brutal warfare, humanity could survive through individuals and nations that chose compassion over revenge. The tears were recognition that the world was more complicated and more hopeful than propaganda had suggested, that enemies could become saviors, and that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in territory conquered, but in lives saved from hunger.